This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Get access to CuriosityStream and my streaming service Nebula when you sign up using the link in my description and the code SarahZ. If you've ever been on the internet and expressed any kind of opinion at all, you've probably had some commenter you've never met before demand you debate them and prove your worth in the free marketplace of ideas. And if you've ever been on YouTube and followed your recommended tab for a couple videos, you've probably landed on some kind of streamed or televised debate, often with millions of views and provocative titles. Our society places a lot of value on free and public debate. Part of our emphasis on this, I think, comes from our romanticized ideas of the ancient Greek parliamentary system where people would come together and debate various policy and philosophy topics for hours on end. This idealized concept of a democratic and facts-based approach to policy founded upon healthy discussion is the same idea upon which many people now base their ideas of public discourse. Debates are considered integral to determining who should represent a country as its president or prime minister. Many popular public intellectuals are lauded for their ability to debate one another, and one public figure refusing or ignoring a request to debate another is considered by many evidence that they're afraid of their beliefs being challenged. This is particularly interesting to me since, besides making video essays, I'm also a competitive university debater. For the last 2 years, I was the president of my university's debate society, and I'm now in an administrative role in my country's national debate organization. I'm just gonna say right now, I love it. Within my university debate society, part of my job is to train novices to win debates, and I've both competed in and judged in a lot of competitions across the country. It's interesting because the kind of debate I experience in a competitive setting is very different than the kind I see popularized online. It's kind of like the difference between going to a fencing tournament and sword fighting a stranger behind a Denny's at 3 in the morning. The way debates are considered by many people to be this ultimate determiner of someone's objective correctness is a little concerning to me as someone who's won a good number of debates arguing for things that are, frankly, absolutely terrible ideas. In this video, I want to talk about a few things. First of all, I want to talk about what we can actually garner about a person from watching them debate, and then I'm going to make my case as to why most of what we currently consider debating probably shouldn't be happening in its present form. Finally, I'm going to talk about the positives we can take from doing debating as a whole. Watching someone debate is so interesting because I think how someone debates says a lot about them as a person. Do they wait their time to speak or do they speak over others? How do they respond when asked a difficult question? Is their rhetoric focused mostly on the arguments at hand, or do they try to change the topic when things get dicey? What I don't think you can glean from a debate is how correct someone is. I mean, if you're debating a truism like do squirrels have 8 legs, pretty much no amount of flashy verbal tricks is going to make you sound correct. But when it comes to policy debates or contentious topics, a good rhetorician can make any variety of ideas sound convincing. If the argument is like, should we ban people over 65 from voting, you can probably invoke a lot of fancy tricks discussing the future of humanity and long-term decision-making that sound really great and convincing in theory, even though in real life we're talking about taking people's human rights away. Conversely, if someone is arguing against a really bad idea, but they're not super experienced with being put on the spot and they're stumbling over their words and can't immediately find the best answer to a question, they're probably not going to seem very convincing, even if in actuality their ideas are completely correct. Another thing I think is worth mentioning is that when it comes to debates with an audience, the goal is generally not to try to convince the person you're debating with so much as another third party, like the public or a judge. I mean, if it's just you and your friend discussing the merits of, like, The Last Jedi, you might be trying to change each other's minds, but for the most part, no one in, like, a presidential debate is suddenly gonna stop and say something like, you know what, that's actually a really good point, I've changed my mind. Similarly, in formal competitive debates, you have a panel of judges you need to convince, and no matter how swayed by your opponent's arguments you are, you need to stick to your own. What these two facts together mean is that public debates generally aren't about convincing people of your arguments through factual correctness and logic. Rather, televised and streamed debates are a sort of public pageantry. Your goal is generally less so to be right so much as to look right. Of course, in an ideal situation, you can be both. You can have the most correct arguments while still sounding the most persuasive. But those two things aren't mutually inclusive. You can and do often have one without the other. That doesn't mean we can't learn anything from watching someone debate. How someone conducts themselves in this public setting is still very telling. This is especially true when it comes to presidential and parliamentary debates. They're a good way to tell how someone responds to situations of disagreement, how they handle tough questions under pressure, and how they balance assertiveness and diplomacy, and debates can do this in a way that other settings, like controlled interviews and rallies, can't by introducing a degree of accountability and unpredictability. I think this is a valid enough reason to have these debates in and of itself, so long as they're understood for what they are and winning one isn't treated as synonymous with being right. But how about when we're not talking about figures we need to decide whether or not to elect into public office? What about, for example, public intellectuals debating one another on the best economic system, or YouTubers having live stream debates about representation on TV? If debates are mostly representative of someone's argumentative skills and ability to handle stressful situations, and not whether or not that person is right, how do these debates influence our idea of public discourse? Personally, as someone who's done a lot of debate and has invested years of time and energy into the topic, I think this kind of public discourse is not necessarily useful. I mean, also, they just make debaters look bad, and it's really embarrassing for us. In the debate world, it's mostly treated as a kind of sport, a way to practice your argumentative and critical thinking skills. Winning a debate about a certain topic doesn't signal to anyone present that that says anything about the topic's objective correctness. But when society places an intense importance on these debates and on using them as a measure of an idea's merits, harmful effects can quickly take hold. Many people will watch a clip of someone destroying or annihilating certain viewpoints in a debate and conclude from that 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 viewpoint has just been proven objectively invalid, and to me, that's kind of concerning. That's not to say good, well-handled, and quality public debates don't exist. Certainly, I think they do. Unfortunately, though, I think they kind of make up a minority of what we're seeing right now, which is why I would advise anyone to be extremely careful if they're either planning on watching a debate between public figures or if they're being asked to debate someone. While this isn't universally true, and I'll get back to that later, I think there are often better ways to critically engage with these ideas than the public debate format. I want to give you examples of how these debates between public figures can affect public discourse in ways that are useless at best and actively damaging at worst. First, I want to give you an example of how the public performance of debate can empower people with persuasive rhetoric but flimsy arguments even when they are in the wrong. And then I'm going to give you an example of how even when you're in the right and you win the debate, you can still end up wasting your time or platforming harmful ideas if you're not very careful. I'd also like to clarify that I do support varied discussion with people I don't agree with. Many of my friends have very different perspectives than I do, and if I know someone is acting in good faith and trust them to be as respectful as I'll be, I'm usually happy to sit down and have a conversation with them. Of course, there are certain ideas that I don't personally think should be treated as debatable in any way. Should we be doing more hate crimes isn't a real question, and I'm not going to be friends with you if you think people should be persecuted on the basis of who they are. But I think, barring those extremes, having conversations with people you disagree with is healthy for a variety of reasons. When I say we shouldn't be having this many public debates and treating them as measures of moral or argumentative correctness, I'm not talking about personal discussions. I'm talking about the publicized pageantry of debating, where the primary goal is to convince onlookers and the main focus is not on finding common ground, but on winning. I don't think this is a healthy way to engage in public discourse, and I hope to articulate why. When a lot of people are asked nowadays to name people they consider particularly influential debaters, a lot of names that come up are associated with the intellectual dark web. Basically, a group of personalities like Jordan Peterson, Charlie Kirk, or Ben Shapiro, who brand themselves on intellectual debate and on the tenet that their ideas are being silenced in the mainstream. According to this philosophy, there are certain ideas that some people are hesitant to discuss out of fear, causing significant damage to academic spaces. But not these guys. Not these very smart and brave good boys. Rather, their aim is supposedly to dismantle dominant narratives in these spaces, which in practice usually just means not calling trans people by their pronouns, and they aim to do so through public debate. A lot of these people rose to prominence at least partially from clips of themselves taking down or destroying the arguments of various naysayers, most of whom are not debaters themselves. And it works wonders. Ben Shapiro in particular has made a career largely on the back of videos of himself destroying college snowflakes. Now, I'm about to be critical of Ben Shapiro, but I do want to emphasize, as I try to do in all of my videos where I criticize individuals, that I'm using this guy as an example of a broader societal problem. He is not the only person who exemplifies these issues, and if we woke up tomorrow and Ben Shapiro had magically poofed out of existence, this would still be a problem. I don't want this video to be considered a response to any one person so much as an exploration of a broad societal issue. With that said, I think Ben Shapiro is a really great example of why sounding rhetorically smooth in a debate does not necessarily equal strong arguments. However, because we as members of the public tend to have a lot of trust in the process of a debate and view it as an essential part of a healthy democracy, sounding good in a debate can make people like Ben Shapiro seem like trustworthy figures to a lot of people. What's interesting to me is the fact that when you search up Ben Shapiro debate on YouTube, the top results are, with a couple exceptions, almost exclusively him A, debating random university students and not other journalists with a similar level of prestige, and B, not formal moderated debates where both parties are given equal time to speak and rebut one another, but rather digressions from Shapiro's speeches, in which he always has the last word and can speak over the others at any time. I've been to a lot of debate tournaments, and basically the way bracketing works is that after each round, they try to pair you with a team that's won the same number of rounds that you have so you can be fairly matched with a competitive opponent. The first round is pretty random though, so you do end up with a lot of unequal matches. Some of my friends who have been debating for over a decade have gotten matched up with people who have never even been to a debate tournament before in round 1 and, unsurprisingly, end up beating them pretty definitively. What I have never seen is any seasoned debater genuinely get excited about beating a novice. Generally speaking, you want to beat people who are equal or better debaters than you because it signifies growth and it's personally satisfying. Beating someone with no formal debate training doesn't actually mean you're a good debater, it just means you've been matched with an unskilled opponent. What Ben Shapiro does is effectively the debate equivalent of an average quality sprinter exclusively challenging children to races where he gets extra time and then going, "Look, but I won most of these matches, I must be the greatest player of all time." This is further evidenced by the fact that when Shapiro does engage with actual journalists and people his own age, he tends not to fare very well. Take Shapiro's interview with journalist Andrew Neil pertaining to his new book. Neil pointed out numerous examples of Ben Shapiro contributing to and benefiting from a culture of anger and personal attacks, despite the fact that Shapiro's book blamed the left for public discourse becoming less civil. As the interview continued and Neil kept bringing up more and more quotes, many of which Shapiro still stood by, Ben Shapiro quickly became more and more flustered. He then accused Neil, a hardline conservative, of being a leftist before resulting to personal insults and cutting the interview short. Shapiro himself later acknowledged that he wasn't properly prepared for Neil's comments, leading him to lose the debate, but followed up that acknowledgement with an article claiming the majority of those quotes were either taken out of context or were things that were completely true that liberals just didn't like. This is interesting to me because Shapiro is clearly capable of understanding that sounding the most eloquent and rhetorically correct in a debate does not actually mean that your position is the correct one. Similarly, losing a debate does not mean you're wrong. The fact that he's linked to a website effectively saying, "Listen, I lost a debate on this matter because I wasn't ready, but I'm still right about it," is evidence enough. What's interesting to me is that he doesn't hold debates where he supposedly wins to this standard. Owning an 18-year-old who didn't go to law school and wasn't trained in argument while you have the mic and most of the speaking time and only allow that 18-year-old to contribute to the conversation when it personally benefits you is extremely easy. You can do it with any topic. That does not mean that you are actually correct, and it does not mean that you are a good debater. But the fact that Ben Shapiro continues to make destroying college cucks or whatever a significant part of his brand signifies that not only does he get a lot of validation out of these debates, he seems to think winning them makes him correct. But even more so than this, even in these conversations with 18-year-old college students, Ben Shapiro is still not actually a good debater. I mean, he imitates the aesthetics of what he thinks good debating is, he talks very quickly for long amounts of time and only allows his opponents to cut in when it benefits him. But these aesthetic flares are not a substitute for rationality or logical consistency, and he fails on these fronts repeatedly. In an actual competitive debate, each team has exactly the same amount of time to speak. You can't cut into or interrupt anyone's speech without their explicit permission, and each person has a designated time and space to say exactly what they want to say without being interrupted. A lot of novice debaters I've trained will also imitate the Shapiro aesthetic at first. They'll talk as quickly as possible to make it hard for their opponents to use their time effectively, they'll try to change the topic to make defending their side easier on them, and they'll address only their opponent's weakest arguments while ignoring their strongest. Oftentimes, these novices who may or may not have debated in high school will go to their first university tournament thinking they have everything they need to win each round, and oftentimes they get a pretty rude awakening when they don't place particularly well. Any judge worth their salt will quickly steer them in the right direction, and most learn pretty quickly that you actually need to address your opponent's strongest arguments with logically consistent rebuttals. Watching Ben Shapiro debate reminds me of these novices, but because he's not a real debater and these aren't real debates, there's no external figure to point out that his arguments are inconsistent and aren't particularly strong. I'm going to use a specific video of his to showcase my arguments here, and I chose this video to be fair to Ben Shapiro. The video has mostly positive comments, a pretty good like to dislike ratio, and Shapiro himself seems pretty proud of it. It's not considered one of his worst moments, it's considered pretty par for the course for him. It's a pretty average example of the kind of debates he engages in the regular, which is why I chose it. So, throughout this video, he makes a lot of bad points that get cheers, mostly because they sound like quick, snappy zingers, not because they're well thought out arguments. Let's just look at one clip of Shapiro destroying a student regarding trans issues.
Because for all of human history, boy meant boy and girl meant girl. Boy did not mean girl. And girl. And if I call you a moose, are you suddenly a moose? Okay, if I redefine our terms. No, yes, that's right. Men and women are a completely different thing. This is true. Have you ever met a man or a woman? They're completely different.
Here's one example of what I'm talking about. The student Ben Shapiro is debating is criticizing him for not accepting trans people as the gender they say they are. Ben Shapiro responds by asking her if we should claim someone as a moose because they identify as one. She says that's completely different, and he responds with, exactly, men and women are completely different, and then moves on without addressing her point. This moment in particular strikes me as really disingenuous because surely Ben Shapiro and his audience know that when she says that's completely different, she wasn't talking about the difference between men and women. She was talking about the difference between being transgender and identifying as a moose. Notably, one of these things is a social role where what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman have differed across various cultural and historical lines, and many times were not divided in the same biological binary that Ben Shapiro claims they were. Simply looking at any culture with a historical third gender is evidence enough of this. The same cannot be said for identifying as a moose. Instead of addressing in any meaningful way the argument that identifying as trans is not the same thing as identifying as a moose, Shapiro deliberately misinterpreted her point and then kept going. What's frustrating is that while he never addresses her argument, the next thing he does, repeatedly asking her why aren't you 60 and interrupting her when she tries to reiterate the point she was trying to make, is the exact same type of tactic that Shapiro decries as intellectually dishonest and not allowing him to make his point when interviewers do it to him. Almost as if he knows his tactic of debating isn't remotely about having the most correct arguments, but is instead about making the other party seem foolish and implementing as many dishonest tactics as possible to do so.
Why aren't you 60? Why aren't you 60? And why can't you identify as 60? What is the problem with you identifying as 60?
It's not the same as gender. You can't just...
You're right. Age is significantly less important than gender.
Even then, his argument is not particularly good. Citing age as something biologically determined that has no roots in society or culture is not a very good argument when I'm 21 in Canada but 22 in Korea. Sure, how many years someone has been alive on the planet is a biological thing, but how we choose to categorize it and make laws based on those years is social. Being alive for, say, 15 years in some places means you can drive a car, and in some places means you can't. Kind of like gender, our systems of categorization are indeed dependent on historical and cultural context and aren't the same everywhere. But repeatedly bombarding someone with "why aren't you 60" isn't a good foundation for starting an actual good faith discussion about the difference between biological realities and sociocultural categorization, and Shapiro knows this. He's not trying to be right. He's trying to win. I mean, he himself has said that the only reason he would ever debate someone is to verbally humiliate them, and the emphasis on winning that public debate places on these exchanges doesn't exactly help, especially when you can win without actually being correct. And besides bad arguments, when we do get into cold hard facts, he's not correct about those either.
The idea behind the transgender movement as a civil rights movement is the idea that all of their problems would just go away if I would pretend that they were the sex to which they claim membership. That's nonsense. The transgender suicide rate is 40%. It is 40%. And according to the Anderson School at UCLA, it makes no difference. There's a study that came out last year. It makes no difference, virtually no difference, statistically speaking, as to whether people recognize you as a transgender person or not.
At one point, he brings up the fact that the trans community has a disproportionately high suicide rate, claiming that it has nothing to do with how trans people are treated and everything to do with that being trans is somehow intrinsically linked to suffering. The study he cites, Suicide Attempts Among Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Adults, does find that 41% of trans people attempt suicide. Shapiro also claims that, according to this study, whether or not trans people are accepted as their gender has no relationship to their suicide rate, and that he cannot find any study that suggests this is true. This is debunked in literally the very first page of the study he cites, which finds that trans people who experienced rejection, discrimination, harassment, or social isolation had a significantly higher prevalence of suicide rates than those who did not report experiencing those things. Literally, this is in the summary on the very first page. There is no way you could have missed it. Later on in the study, they also found that people who reported that strangers could not tell that they were transgender had a far lower suicide rate than the average, almost like there's something about how people are treated when others recognize that they're trans that makes them more likely to attempt suicide. The suicide rate was also significantly lower for participants who reported that their families accepted them after they came out. Shapiro is telling a bald-faced lie here, but the problem is that unless that student was expected to whip out her phone in the middle of the argument and Google and read the whole study, there's no way for Shapiro to be fact-checked on this, even if he did let her speak. The way Shapiro primarily engages with ill-prepared students, calls these speeches debates, and then revels in the success he gets from these videos being labeled as like, Shapiro destroys college snowflakes while embarrassing himself in conversations with actual adults is frustrating in and of itself, but the fact that even with this massive advantage of him having the most speaking time and no one being able to call him on his statements right then and there, he's still clearly not making logically consistent arguments is honestly kind of sad. But even more than that, it's evidence of how engaging in debate with people who appear to be skillful rhetoricians but still espouse inaccurate and harmful beliefs can screw you over and make you out to be a ridiculous person, even if you're completely right. Getting flustered in a public forum happens. Most people are not trained debaters, and being interrupted or spoken over can be jarring and frustrating. But in this type of informal debate where looking fancy trumps logical arguments, a lack of immediate witty retorts or ability to fact-check can make you seem unconvincing regardless of the facts. The fact that losing a debate has little to do with your actual correctness, yet losing a debate can harm your credibility in the eyes of onlookers, constitutes a good reason to seriously consider avoiding these types of public discussions. But I think a lot of people seeing this will just say, well, okay, that's all well and good if you don't know how to debate or if you get flustered easily, but that's not the case for me. I know I could destroy these people's arguments if given the chance, and I just want to prove it. So I think it's also worth looking at what happens even when you win these kinds of debates, and how even when the right side comes out on top, it doesn't necessarily translate to the changing of hearts and minds that we want it to. Before we get to this topic, I just want to talk about something fun for a minute. Are you a fan of Dungeons & Dragons? What about Dungeons & Dragons podcasts? What about just like me generally as a person? Maybe you're a fan of one of those things but are not a fan of the other, or maybe you're curious about the other. Well, boy howdy do I have an offer for you. And that offer is that you should listen to Trials and Trebuchets, which is a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons podcast featuring me and some of my friends. It's a really fun story about these 4 kids at like a mysterious magic school as they discover some of the school's secrets, make friends, make rivals, have some good duels, some fights, some mysteries, some good funny joke bits. It's a really wonderful time. I have a lot of fun with it. My friends have a lot of fun with it. We already have a really wonderful community of listeners building up, and it would mean a lot to me for you to check the podcast out and join that community. D&D, TNT. That's not our catchphrase. Well, it is now. Recently, my friend Big Joel debated a YouTuber known as The Quartering, whose videos read like sensationalist tabloid articles and center around complaining about Gamergate in 2019, deriding SJWs, and expressing extreme anger about almost any movie or TV show that mostly features women or queer people, especially kids shows. The debate itself mostly centered around the Quartering's perceived hatred of any material featuring LGBT+ people, particularly because that hatred was couched in language like, I don't mind it, I just don't think it's appropriate for kids. Admittedly, I may be a little biased here in my assessment of the debate, but the Quartering was very evasive and either didn't answer or redirected a large number of Joel's questions and concerns. I will say that's not just my opinion. He himself after the stream admitted he ceded too much ground, and many of his fans agreed. With regards to this particular debate, I think it's fair to say that Joel won it. What didn't appear to happen in the wake of that debate, however, was any significant changing of minds. While many of the Quartering's fans were agreeing that he did not communicate his ideas effectively in the debate, those people were still his fans and weren't asserting that he was wrong, just that he didn't perform adequately.
Ethereus Fox, you were wishy-washy. As a content creator, I was horrified that my characters will be changed to push a cultural agenda or brainwash kids. I mean, maybe. I think what you call wishy-washy means I was just vocalizing, trying to understand where he was coming from.
By and large, these people still agreed with the main ideas he espoused, and their main criticism was with how he presented his ideas. Not only that, but after the debate ended, he refused to give Joel access to the footage so he could review it, taking it off of YouTube immediately afterwards and not responding to requests of the footage for over a week. As it turns out, the Quartering forgot to erase the footage on Twitch, but regardless, it means that the conversation, who got to see the debate, the framing of the debate, and the last word of the debate was controlled entirely by him. Because the Quartering controlled that conversation and that debate took place mostly on his own platform, he was effectively able to negate Joel's good faith efforts and bury the evidence. Joel himself has said that he feels like debating the quartering was a mistake, and I agree. Not because Joel did anything wrong, but because even though he was right and won the debate, the quartering effectively wasted his time. Even if the debate had happened on Joel's channel, and even if the two had acknowledged that they weren't likely to change each other's minds, I think the harms of debating this guy still would have outweighed the positives. For one, it would give him an unnecessary platform to further make claims that attack certain groups, like implications that seeing gay characters on TV is inherently bad for children. I know some people don't like the idea that certain views shouldn't be given platforms, but ultimately I think all interactions are kind of a matter of determining what to platform. If someone comes up to you and says, "I think birds don't exist and the earth is shaped like an ice cream cone," you could debate them, but I think most people would agree that treating it like a topic that needs to be debated and taken seriously is ridiculous, and that you could be using your time and energy in much more valuable ways. Not every topic creates quality debates. The same applies here, where it's just a matter of choosing what to prioritize and what to platform. No single person platforms every idea they're exposed to or treats every single thing they hear as debate-worthy, and that's not a reasonable expectation of people. That's not to say every debate topic is inherently unreasonable or unworthy of being given a platform. In fact, I think most aren't, but in cases where both people have relatively reasonable perspectives, I still don't think a debate is usually the best format for that kind of conversation. If your perspectives aren't both reasonable and one or both of you aren't acting in good faith, I think it's self-evident to say that debating them is kind of gonna be a waste of time. And if you are both acting in good faith with reasonable perspectives, there are often better alternatives like non-showy conversations that take the focus off of winning while still permitting a dialogue to take place. That being said, it is true that debates do have the power to change certain people's minds for better or for worse. Like I said in my Ben Shapiro section, if you can't immediately fact-check the guy, his arguments might sound convincing. Certainly, it's possible that that power could be harnessed for good. One YouTuber, who made a particularly profound video about how he was pulled out of his hateful beliefs, cited watching a live-streamed debate wherein some of his own beliefs were challenged and debunked as a jumping-off point for further questioning his views. I don't want to claim that debates are never able to change people's minds, or that it's impossible that someone can use the format of public debate for doing good. And it is true that if you have the rhetorical ability to make your points sound compelling and convincing, debating with people you disagree with could help expose their audience to your ideas and do some good. But a lot of factors need to be present in order for that to be the correct decision. You need to be a genuinely skilled rhetorician with good intentions, you need neutral ground where one person does not have greater power and control over the conversation than the other, and when it comes to beliefs that could have genuinely harmful effects if given a platform, the benefits of this debate to society in general should vastly outweigh the potential harms. In my opinion, these caveats don't tend to apply to the majority of these sensationalized public debates, which mostly end up being either ineffectual by wasting people's times or actively harmful by acclimatizing people to misinformation that's masked in pretty words. Granted, debates aren't the only way that grifters can couch lies and pseudo-intellectual nonsense to make them seem more palatable. But because debate is considered such a cornerstone of democracy as opposed to like saying your random shit on a blog somewhere, it gives these ideas a greater facade of legitimacy. Thus, generally speaking, I think we should choose to restrict our participation in public debates to those that meet the aforementioned parameters, and we should be devoting similar time and resources to other forms of educative outreach, which, depending on your message and audience, could look like anything from YouTube videos to in-person community engagement. From the perspective of anyone who's been constantly bombarded with debate me, I hope this video can serve as a general argument for why, in most cases, you probably shouldn't engage. If they're a bad faith actor, there are a variety of potential harms, from making you look bad to wasting your time to giving horrible views unnecessary attention that don't make the benefits worth it. And if they're acting in good faith and you're genuinely interested in a conversation, consider using a different form of dialogue that doesn't primarily emphasize winning. On the other hand, if you're an audience member who genuinely enjoys watching these kinds of debates, I would encourage people to pass a critical eye over them. If you like watching them, I'm not going to tell you to stop, but it's best to take them as what they are, a test of someone's rhetorical skills and potentially their character, but not of their factual correctness. And if you see one public figure refuse to debate another, don't take that as a sign of their cowardice or fear of hearing another opinion. There are a lot of valid reasons to refuse. Honestly, as much as I rag on debates here, I would genuinely encourage anyone who is interested, particularly if you're a student, to check out the world of competitive debating. Like I said earlier, it's a lot more carefully moderated than the public pop culture kinds of debates, and there's actual equity and standards in place to make sure things that are actually contentious are the only things being discussed, so there's no, "should we be doing genocide, guys?" I also think a lot of people can benefit from learning debate skills even if they're not interested in becoming debaters themselves. A lot of what debating teaches you is critical thinking skills. If you're arguing against someone who's really good at fast talking and verbal switcheroos, you're going to have to learn very quickly to get to the crux of their argument so you can figure out how to refute them. In a world where we're unfortunately exposed to a lot of misinformation in the place of quality arguments, an activity that enables you to better identify and combat it is really helpful. It's also just great for improving your confidence and communication skills, and I can attest to the fact that it's honestly a lot of fun as long as you take it for what it is. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to call up some friends and argue about Steven Universe. I'd like to thank CuriosityStream for sponsoring this video. Basically, CuriosityStream is a really cool streaming site that's full of thousands of documentaries and other nonfiction, including some original content featuring people like Stephen Hawking and David Attenborough. It includes a lot of material on tons of different topics like science, art, and history, and as I'm sure you guys can tell, I'm really into learning and teaching about various social issues in ways that are fun and interesting, so I've been really into the series Stories of Impacts lately. It's these 7 documentaries that talk about different people's life experiences, from a group of young South African radio reporters to a story about top universities trying to find intelligent young people around the world who wouldn't typically have access to education. There's some really interesting stuff there, and you can watch the whole series and thousands of other documentaries for just $2.99 a month. Not only that, but if you go to curiositystream.com/SarahZ and use the promo code SarahZ during sign up, your first 31 days are completely free. CuriosityStream has also teamed up with the streaming service Nebula. Basically, Nebula is a collaborative effort between me and tons of other independent content creators who make educational videos like CGP Grey and Minute Physics. It also has a bunch of Nebula originals, so you can watch content by creators you love that you can't get anywhere else. Supporting Nebula supports me and the educational content creator community in general. Not only that, but if you get a year's subscription to CuriosityStream, it now also comes with a subscription to Nebula. That's basically twice the educational content for one subscription, and it's wonderful. Special thank you to all my patrons. I would like to specially thank Nothing Big and Chad Taylor for joining my $20 plus tier.